Hello, well thank you so much for coming out to hear my paper. I hope you enjoy it. One thing that's concerned me slightly is whether I'm pitching it at the right level. Am I giving you the right number of background information? I'm hoping I'm explaining everything nice and clearly, so if you're not a specialist, you'll be able to follow what I'm saying, but I really do hope that I've supplied enough background information for you to follow my overall argument. So, I'll get started. I'm going to be doing this normal sort of paper format of reading my argument, but I hope you find it interesting. So, the title is Encountering the Turks, the First Crusaders foreknowledge of their enemy, some preliminary findings. This is part of a wider project that I'm doing, looking at the way in which the Crusaders, the way in which they perceived their Muslim opponents, the way in which they approached them, what their attitudes were. It's very much a revisionist study, really, trying to tackle some of the big assumptions that have been made in this particular area. So, in 1095, Pope Urban II gave his famous sermon at the Council of Clermont, launching the First Crusade. This event is a key moment in world history, and many studies discuss it generally, and then go on to explain how the crusade was directed specifically against the Seljuk Turks. This is very straightforward and well known. In defining the Crusaders' enemy as the Turks, such historians are, in one sense, absolutely correct. The Crusaders did set out to the east, fully aware that they would encounter an enemy. That's why they were armed. And as historians, we know that the enemy was the Turks. It's easy to assume, however, that the Crusaders were therefore familiar with the Turks, and some historians have even argued that Christian knights were recruited for the campaign in a hate-filled reaction to papal anti-Turkish propaganda. Despite statements of this kind, I'll just let you come in and sit down. Despite statements of this kind, little research has been conducted upon the question of the Crusaders' prior knowledge of the Turks, who were, after all, the enemy they were marching to meet. How much did they know about them? On this point, the chronicles written by the Crusaders can offer only a limited amount of assistance. They were produced by veterans who had survived years of relentless warfare with the Turks, and their accounts reflect these experiences. For the same reason, the narratives written subsequently by those who had access to participant narratives or to the recollections of returning Crusaders are, for the same reason, a poor guide. Consequently, this article will draw upon surviving material produced during or in advance of the recruitment phase of the First Crusade to discuss how much was known about the Turks by the pilgrims who joined the First Crusade, and by extension, the routes by which knowledge of the Seljuk advances could have reached Western Europe before their departure. Within this, the role played by the Byzantine Empire in shaping the Crusaders' preconceptions of their future foe will receive particular attention. Okay. So before the year 1000, the Turks had yet to make much of an impression on the affairs of the Near East. Some warrior groups had travelled west and taken service with leading Arab dynasties. Others were brought to the area as slaves. Nevertheless, it was only in the early years of the 11th century that the Turkish tribes began to migrate westwards in significant numbers. As the century progressed, the migrations of the Ughuz Turks gathered momentum under the leadership of the Seljuk dynasty, which began to assert its supremacy across Persia. Seljuk power continued to rise, and in 1055, Togril Beg took control of Baghdad, assuming the title of Sultan. In later decades, the Seljuks continued to expand westwards into Syria, taking the major cities of Damascus and Aleppo in 1076 and 1086 respectively. Only Fatimid Egypt managed to stem the Turkish advance, defeating an advancing Turkish army in 1077. The first identified Turkish raid into Byzantine territory occurred in 1029, and in later years, many towns and cities fell to their incursions. In 1071, the Byzantines suffered their famous major defeat at Manzikert, and in the following years, as the empire descended into civil war and as Turkmen tribes invaded to the east, much of Anatolia was lost. Thus the Turks fundamentally redrew the map of the Near East, breaching long-established frontiers and plunging many regions into confusion. The Byzantines, for their part, by the time of the 11th century, they had long been aware of the Turks. They knew them to be a steppe people who were related to the Pechenegs, and some authors conflated them with the Hungarians, the Magyars. Consequently, when news of the Seljuk advance reached Constantinople, writers could draw upon a corpus of received wisdom to assist them in their identification of this foe. Now, this is the point I want to stress. Western Christendom was not in the same position. At its easternmost point, it was still very far removed from the Anatolian frontier, and it was therefore dependent upon news it received either through Byzantine envoys or through Western travellers passing through this region. Moreover, as will be shown, the accumulated wisdom contained in Christendom's archives preserved very few memories of the Turks. When Urban launched his crusade to the east then, he was instigating a campaign against an enemy that had only recently appeared on Western Europe's horizons. Thus, it cannot be guaranteed that the Turks were widely known, and the nature and extent of the information available to those who would later participate in the First Crusade requires close examination. A natural starting point in this investigation is to examine the surviving materials for Pope Urban II's efforts to raise forces for the campaign. Given that the crusade was launched in part to fight an enemy which we now know to have been the Seljuks, Urban's descriptions and definitions of that opponent bear directly upon the question of the participants' preconceptions and foreknowledge of the Turks. As is well known, the core ideas in Urban's famous sermon at Clermont are difficult to recreate from the surviving sources. The main accounts were written after the crusade by authors who had, whether through the exigencies of the campaign or through the reports of returning pilgrims, acquired strong attitudes concerning the Turks. There is therefore every possibility that their versions of the Clermont address, and by extension their depictions of the Turks, were informed by this later knowledge and do not reflect Urban's actual words or ideas. Urban's letters for the period 1095 to 1098, which touch upon the crusade, are a better guide. Several of these discuss his objectives explicitly, and at such moments the term most commonly used to define the expedition's opponent is Saracens. Saracens are the sole named enemy in two of Urban's letters, one to the monks of Vallombrosa in 1096 and one written in the same year to 3 Spanish counts in northern Spain at that particular point. Nevertheless, different descriptors appear in other communications, and in a letter to the Count of Flanders, Urban described the need to defeat, and I quote, the barbaric rage which was destroying the churches of God in the regions of the Orient. Another letter, written for the people of Bologna, speaks more generally about the liberation of the church. It was only in 1098, with the crusade well underway, and with the earliest reports of their activities filtering back to the west, that the word Turk made its first appearance in Urban's correspondence. Reviewing the names Urban used to describe his foe, it is notable that despite the fact the word Saracens, which ascribes a specifically Islamic character to the Crusade's enemy, appears twice, perhaps the most striking feature of the terminology is its inconsistency. There is no single enemy which is named in all cases, and this pairs well with wider contemporary evidence for Urban's preaching, which is equally blurred. Count Fulda-Reichin, for example, writing in 1096, described Urban's appeal for crusaders at Angers, claiming that the pontiff had called upon warriors to fight Gentiles. It may also be relevant to note that when Bernold, a monk at All Saints in Schaffenhausen, described the arrival of a legation from Alexius I at Piacenza in March 1095, he stated that the Byzantines sought aid against the pagans. The surviving texts, which briefly outline the decrees promulgated at Clermont concerning the crusade, either mention no enemy at all, or in one case describe them as Saracens. Consequently, whilst the term Saracens appears with the greatest regularity, the only consistent line that can be drawn through the various descriptors used in papal preaching is that the Crusade's anticipated foe was given as a non-Christian people of some kind. No source before 1098 names the Turks explicitly. A supplementary group of sources which reflects upon this matter is the Crusade Charters, which were written by or for those who had taken the cross. These documents, written for the most part in Frankish territory, were largely produced to record legal transactions made between an individual crusader and a religious house. They report a range of activities: land sold to raise money for the campaign, pious donations in return for prayer for a crusader's journey, and the purchase of baggage animals. In his pioneering work on these charters, Riley Smith has established that many key themes which formed part of the papacy's crusade propaganda were referenced in these charters, thus demonstrating the transmission of key concepts from the papacy and its preachers to their intended audience. With this in mind, it is instructive to explore how the campaign's future enemy was defined in these charters, because in the same way, it's likely that they would draw upon the names utilised in crusade preaching. This is particularly the case for documents produced at those religious houses which Pope Urban either visited during his preaching tour for the crusade or those situated near to his preaching route. At such monasteries or abbeys, the scribes who wrote the charters for the Crusaders may either have heard Urban preach in person or would have known someone who had. Several institutions fit this category, and many of them generated charters for pilgrims departing over the next couple of years for Jerusalem. To take an example, the Abbey of Marmoutier issued several charters for pilgrims, and 3 of these mention the Crusade's enemies. All 3 give the name pagans for the Crusade's enemy. Other charters from Marmoutier do not describe any opponent, but simply give Jerusalem as the goal. Incidentally, the tendency among charters to give Jerusalem as the sole objective for the campaign is typical of the vast majority of these documents written between 1096 and 1101. From a sample of 67 such documents examined for this article, all but 1 give the desire to reach Jerusalem as at least one of the reasons for taking part, and for 81% of these documents, it is the sole stated purpose. This is true of 2 further charters produced at the Abbey of Saint-Jean-d'Angely, which Urban visited whilst en route for Bordeaux. Only one of the charters issued at Cluny specified the objective of fighting an enemy. This was a document written for Arcade of Montbal, who was described as wish to make war upon pagans and Saracens. At the Abbey of Saint-Martial in Limoges, a document written for Aymeri Brun likewise specifies fighting Saracens as one of the objectives. Overall, the most frequently employed descriptor used in this sample of charters is pagans. Of the documents examined, 67% of those which name an enemy describe the enemy as pagans. During the 11th century, the name pagans appears frequently in many types of sources and was essentially a generic term for non-believers. Overall, therefore, given the frequency of references to pagans in the charters produced during the early stages of the campaign, including some of those written in monasteries which Urban visited, the possibility must be entertained that this name was also used in crusade preaching. Cumulatively, the impression conveyed by the charters is that the pilgrims had received very little information or disinformation about the enemy they were marching to fight through papal crusading propaganda. Moreover, again, the name Turk does not appear at any point in any charter. These findings are significant for several reasons. Perhaps the most significant point is that they show that the First Crusade was not explicitly, at least, launched against the Turks, even if they were among its intended targets. Moreover, the charters suggest that the Turks were not explicitly singled out, possibly not even mentioned in the preaching. Even specifically Islamic terms such as Saracens only appear sporadically if we incorporate the charters as well. This is perhaps the clearest conclusion that can be drawn from this group of sources, and it dramatically underlines the notion that the Turks, or even to some extent Muslims, were othered or purposefully vilified during the recruitment process. Thus, this evidence then does not support the notion that the preaching for the Crusade was a conduit through which the Crusaders learned much about the Turkish enemy they were marching to fight. Reflecting on these findings, it's natural to ask why the papacy chose to use such vague terms for the Crusade's enemy. It's also necessary to consider whether the complete absence of references to Turks in every type of source concerning the Crusade pre-1098 indicates a widespread ignorance of this people group across Francia. The papacy itself would, of course, have been fully aware of the Turks. It had long been in communication with the Byzantine court and would probably have learned of the approaching Seljuks at some point in the 11th century. It remains to be established, however, why Urban evidently chose not to name the Turks as the campaign's opponent when raising forces for the First Crusade. It's tempting to conclude that he did not refer to them because he and other papal preachers were aware that the Franks were almost entirely unfamiliar with the Seljuk Turks. They therefore selected only generic terms such as pagan that they could be sure that their audience would understand, whilst avoiding names for that audience, avoiding names that that audience could not be expected to know. It might be pointed out that Urban was, after all, the son of a Frankish knightly family and would have known the limits of his audience's knowledge. Thus, the argument could be made that the Franks marched to the east, knowing only that a non-Christian enemy of some kind awaited them, but with no clear knowledge of the Turks. Nevertheless, it's difficult to be sure on this point. The possibility has to be entertained that the vague descriptions found in papal correspondence and replicated in the charters reflect long-standing topological trends in papal documentation and do not serve as indicators for their author's knowledge. The evidence for this is in a number of parts. The lack of references to the Turks in the First Crusade Charters, but it's an absence that continues well into the 12th century when information concerning the Turks had circulated far more widely. During the Second Crusade, for example, after decades of war against the Turks in the Latin East, when the campaign's main opponent was the Turkish ruler Zengi, the charters still define their enemy as pagan Saracens or enemies of the cross of Christ, not Turks. Admittedly, there are far fewer Second Crusade charters which mention any foe. Their preambles tend to be shorter than those of the First Crusade. Nevertheless, they still contain no references to Turks. The same is also true of charters produced for the Templars during the first decades of their existence. Again, those documents which name any enemy continue to use general terms such as pagans, or in some cases, largely in documents concerned with the Iberian Wars, Saracens. The only identified charter in the first half of the 12th century to include the name Turks in any context was not directly concerned with crusading. It described a donation made to the Abbey of Charroux, but in dating the transaction, it noted that it took place in the second year after Jerusalem was taken from Turks and pagans. In general, then, the charters demonstrate a remarkable consistency in their continued use of generic terms, particularly pagans, when defining their enemy, even at a time when the Turks were becoming widely known across Christendom following the return of the First Crusaders. This is an important point because if the names used in these documents reflected the extent of their author's knowledge concerning their enemies in the East, then surely, in some cases at least, the term Turk would have replaced the term pagan at some point in the 12th century. Nevertheless, this did not occur, raising the possibility that the use of words such as pagan or Saracen do not reflect the extent of their author's knowledge, but reflect standard patterns of terminology. An instructive example which demonstrates that one abbey at least had access to more specific information concerning the Turks than its charters suggest can be seen with the Abbey of Marmoutier. In an account of the translation of a relic, the head of St. James the Persian, from Asia Minor to the monastery of Courmaray, the author, a monk named Guilielmus Ludovicus, mentioned another monastic traveller who may have been his brother, called Goibertus. Goibertus was present in Constantinople at the time of Guilielmus's arrival, and he too was in Alexius's service. Thus he must surely have been fully aware of the Turks. Goibertus then returned to the west at some point before 1090, joining the Abbey of Marmoutier. By 1092, he had become the prior of Saint-Martin near Châteaudun, and Goibertus is important for the present analysis because he represents a potential channel of communication between the affairs of the East and the Abbey of Marmoutier shortly before the First Crusade. With his background, it might be expected that, upon returning to Western Europe, he would have regaled his monks with tales of Byzantium, leaving the authorities in Marmoutier in a far stronger position to subsequently identify the Crusade's Turkish opponents in their charters. Nevertheless, the latter part of this process does not seem to have taken place. As we have seen, no charter from the Abbey provides any descriptor more precise than pagan when describing the campaign's enemy. Even the document produced for Count Stephen of Blois, who was personally known to Goibertus, mentions only pagans. Moreover, in one charter concerning the sale of some property to the Abbey, a transaction that Goibertus handled himself in person, still only names pagans. Given Goibertus' close proximity to this transaction, it is particularly striking that the enemy is still defined as pagans, when the author must surely have known, through Goibertus, that the enemy they were actually marching to face was indeed the Turks. The only conclusion that can be drawn is that the author must have been aware of the Turks and yet chose to use the more general term pagan when describing the Crusade's opponents. In this case at least, the lack of precision in the Charter's terminology almost certainly does not reflect the extent of the information available at the religious house where it was produced. Consequently, while the Charters may help to identify the way in which the papacy presented the Crusade's opponents in its preaching, they are an uncertain indicator as to the pre-existing level of knowledge concerning the Turks in the Kingdom of France. Right, bear with me one moment. Right, to summarise the findings so far, whatever the Crusaders knew in advance about the Turks, they had clearly not acquired that information from Crusade preaching. There were, however, other channels of communication by which knowledge of the Seljuks could have reached Western Europe in advance of the campaign, and these will now be examined. Turks make only rare appearances in the sources predating the First Crusade, but they do appear occasionally. To take a very early case, the 7th century Chronicle of Fredegar mentions them in a tale concerning the history of the Franks. This story begins with the fall of Troy, of all things, and goes on to describe the subsequent Trojan diaspora. Its main purpose is to demonstrate that the Franks were descended from Trojan refugees who, after long wandering in Eurasia, had arrived in France. Within his narrative, he mentions a subgroup of the Franks who settled along the Danube, who were ruled by a king called Torquath, whose people became known as the Turki, or Turks. According to legend, then, the Franks and Turks shared a common descent. Naturally, Fredegar's chronicle was written centuries before the First Crusade, but it has a question on the Crusaders' ideas surrounding the Turks because it demonstrates that the Turks were not entirely unknown in the Frankish tradition, but more importantly, because the crusading narrative, the Gesta Francorum, likewise reports and confirms a claim made apparently by the Turks that they and the Franks shared a common descent. A question arises, therefore, around whether the Gesta was in some way drawing upon a long-standing and well-known tradition of which Fredegar's chronicle was part. Stephen Runciman's view on this question is that this story, that the Franks and Turks were closely related, long persisted in Iceland, from where it was carried to Asia Minor by warriors serving as Varangians, who then told the Turks, possibly following Manzikert, who then told the Crusaders. Alan Murray, however, has rightly pointed out that this chain of events rather strains credulity, and he proposed the idea that the Gesta Francorum was unlikely to have been drawing upon an earlier tradition, but was merely trying to find a reason for the Turks' competence in battle by creating a common ancestry with the Franks. Murray's explanation is the more plausible of the two, and it's difficult to take this debate any further without additional sources, but the possibility remains that some memory of this link remained. Whilst Fredegar's account raises some interesting questions, it's also the only explicit reference to the Turks located in Western European sources before the 10th century. Even when the name Turk resurfaced in the work of Luitprand of Cremona, who died in 972, it did so in a rather different form. In his chronicle, Antipodosis, he used the name Turk as a synonym for Hungarians. During Luitprand's lifetime, the Hungarians were still pagan, and so they appear in his narrative as entrenched opponents of Christendom. To take one example, Luitprand describes the battle fought between King Louis IV of East Francia at Lecce in 910, using the terms Hungary and Turkey interchangeably. He discussed the Turkey or Turks subsequently in a poem which touched upon their depredations using standard terminology reserved for pagan attackers, presenting them as an evil race and enemies of God. Nevertheless, the identification of Hungarians as Turks was not common practice in Western Christendom, and nor was it strictly accurate. Few Latin authors writing later presented the Turks in this way, and the Hungarians themselves are of Finno-Ugaric extraction, although admittedly, having lived for many centuries on the steppe, they had picked up some elements of Turkish culture and language. European authors, both contemporary and in later centuries, tended instead to describe the Hungarians as Hungary or Huns. Luitprand's inspiration for using this ethnic descriptor seems rather to derive from Byzantine practice, which frequently conflated Turks and Hungarians. This practice occurs widely in Byzantine sources for this period, including the histories of John Skylites and various texts attributed to Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, who died in 959. In his work on court protocol, Constantine outlined the correct modes of address to be used when dealing with foreign dignitaries, explained that Hungarian leaders were to be described as archons of the Turks. Indeed, the Hungarians were referred to as Turks by the Byzantines, even in an inscription on a crown sent from Constantinople to the Hungarians in the late 11th century. Luitprand's employment of this distinctively Byzantine term is hardly surprising. He travelled to Constantinople on several occasions and learnt Greek there between 949 and 950. Antipodosis itself is studied with Greek phrases and references. Other channels of communication by which Western Christendom learnt of the Turks in advance of the Crusade were through pilgrims, merchants and mercenaries travelling back from Byzantium and the Near East. The Amalfitans and Venetians, for example, developed strong commercial links with Fatimid Egypt, the Levantine littoral, and the Byzantine Empire during this time. It was the Amalfitans who, in the late 11th century, founded two hospices in Jerusalem, one dedicated to John the Baptist, which of course would later become the Order of the Hospital of St. John, and the other one founded in Antioch. During the late 11th century, both these cities fell to the Turks. Fatimid held Jerusalem in 1071 or 73, and Byzantine held Antioch in 1084. And it's likely that some news of these events would have filtered back to Italy through these traders. Hugh of Fleury, a monk at the Benedictine Abbey of Fleury-sur-Loire, reported that a group of merchants from Bari sent out in 1087 to trade in Antioch, but having put in on the south coast of Asia Minor, learnt that the region had been devastated by the Turks. Clearly they at least had heard of the Turks. Many Normans and other warriors serving with the Byzantine army in Anatolia during the 11th century also clearly acquired experience of the Turks, both as adversaries and as allies. Reports from these soldiers were evidently transmitted back to Europe because several Norman chroniclers included stories from the Anatolian frontier in their narratives. These are among the few sources produced in Western Christendom in advance of the Crusade, which specifically name the Turks in Asia Minor. Amatus of Monte Cassino, for example, writing in 1080, described the deeds of Roussel de Belial at the Battle of Manzikert. He describes Roussel's honourable treatment by the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan following his capture during the battle, his subsequent attempts to carve out his own territory in Asia Minor, and finally his imprisonment by the Turks. Notably, his account is more hostile towards the Greeks, who are shown to be treacherous and malicious, than towards the Turks themselves. Later writers who described the Battle of Manzikert, including William of Apulia, who wrote an account of the life of Robert Guiscard at the time of the First Crusade, also mention the Turks. He is more hostile than Amatus towards the Turks, noting their massacres in Asia Minor, although like Amatus he describes Romanus Diogenes being graciously received by the Sultan following the battlefield defeat. He also mentions the attempts made by the Byzantines to recruit Norman knights to face the Turks. Therefore, whether through ambassadors, mercenaries, or merchants, there were multiple routes by which some future participants in the Crusade, particularly those who were raised on the Mediterranean coastline, could have received reports of the Seljuk invasions. It's significant to note, however, that many of those groups or individuals who had acquired some knowledge of the Turks had done so through Byzantine channels. The above-mentioned Amalfitan merchants from Bari learned about the Turks when they landed at Myra in southern Anatolia. The Normans carried home news about the Turks having served in the Byzantine army. Liutprand of Cremona seemingly learned about the Turks and learned to describe them as Hungarians from his time in Constantinople. There are several further examples of this Byzantine influence on Christendom's knowledge of the Turks, and one of these can be found in Count Clements of Flanders' letter to the Christian faithful in 1097, concerning the early stages of her husband's crusade. The purpose of her correspondence was to describe her husband's acquisition of relics whilst in Apulia, southern Italy, en route to the Holy Land, then his transmission of these items back to Clemens, and subsequently her actions concerning them. Even so, at the beginning of her letter, she mentions the injuries inflicted against Christians in the Holy Land by Persians. Now, Clemens' letter is the only identified document written in France pre-1099 which uses the name Persians to describe the Turks, and this alone renders it significant. Clearly it was not common parlance in Western Christendom to conflate Turks and Persians, yet significantly, this was routinely the case in Byzantium. This connection occurs in many Greek narratives, and John Skylites even reported that the Empress Theodora had her Macedonian troops transported to Asia Minor, specifically because it was said that the Turks feared that these warriors would inflict the same defeat upon them that Alexander the Great had once inflicted on the Persians. Thus it seems probable that Clemens, like above-mentioned writers, were drawing upon this Byzantine practice. Certainly the House of Flanders had close links with Constantinople in the years before the Council of Clermont in 1095. Robert I of Flanders had made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in 1087 to 1090 and had visited Constantinople on his return journey. During his sojourn there, Alexius I asked him to send aid following his return, and, shortly afterwards, he duly sent 500 warriors to the emperor, who were then deployed against the Turks. It is also possible that Alexius had written to Robert seeking aid before the Crusade. The strong connection between Flanders and Constantinople is confirmed by Urban II in his letter to the people of Flanders encouraging them to take part in the Crusade. He noted in this correspondence that they were well acquainted with the events taking place in the East. With such close and recent ties to Alexius, and fully aware of the threat posed by the Turks, it's hardly surprising that his family had become accustomed to using Byzantine terms, such as pagans, when referring to the Turks. There are many subsequent examples of writers with connections to Byzantium using this term. A few years later, the above-mentioned Gulielmus, describing his service with the Byzantine army, referred to a Turkish ruler as the king of the Persians. William of Apulia and several crusading chronicles, later at least, also acquired this habit. Again, all had connections, whether directly or at second hand, with Byzantium. The examples given above concern returning Western travellers bearing tidings from the East, but the Byzantines themselves seem to have made a concerted effort in the 1090s to draw Christendom's attention to the Turkish threat. Several sources speak generally about Emperor Alexius writing to correspondents in the West seeking aid. There are reports of envoys being sent to the West to secure support during the 11th century, including the famous deputation which joined the Council of Piacenza in March 1095. Naturally, those attending this council or in receipt of Alexius's letters are likely to have been presented with vivid accounts of Turkish activities. Nevertheless, it's unclear precisely what Alexius said in these letters, or indeed what was said on his behalf by these envoys. The only surviving text, which purports to be a letter from the emperor to the Count of Flanders, is mired in controversy and cannot be relied upon to reflect his actual words or ideas. Many other pilgrims travelled to Jerusalem during the later 11th century, and these too, on their return at least, could have acted as conduits for information concerning the advancing Turks, who were active in the Levantine region from circa 1070. Certainly Michael, the Jacobite Patriarch of Antioch, described sustained Turkish attacks against pilgrims, and presumably any survivors from these groups would have carried home reports of this new threat. According to some sources, Peter the Hermit is said to have travelled to Jerusalem in the years before the campaign. Albert of Aachen reports that during his time in the Holy Land, Peter was approached by the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who explained the desperate position of local Christians and asked him to return to Europe to seek aid. Also, the above-mentioned Bernald, and a monk at All Saints in Schaffenhausen, describes the journey of 4 Swabian priests to the Holy City in 1092, but comments only that they encountered troubles and difficulties. He later noted the pagan threat to Constantinople. Specific references to the Turks can be found in the above-mentioned account of the translation of the head of St. James the Persian to the monastery of Cormoré, which you mentioned already, by Gulielmus Ludovicus, but this was written sometime later in 1103. Sorry, I just lost my place. Here we are. As shown above, this source describes the return of the Frankish monk Guibertus from Constantinople in the 1090s. It also discusses the acquisition of this relic by Gulielmus from a monastery in Nicomedia during his sojourn in the Byzantine Empire. At that time, he was serving in an army raised by Alexius I, which reoccupied the town following its capture by the Turks. With this background, he was well placed to comment on Turkish depredations, and he offers an account of their attacks in Asia Minor, describing them as ravening wolves. The question of whether Gulielmus acted as a channel of information concerning the Turks in advance of the Crusade rather depends on the date of his return. He is known to have been present He's known to have presented his relics to Cormeray in 1103, but he may well have returned to the west either during or after the call for the crusade. On this point, it's not possible to be clear. The above-mentioned propensity to use Byzantine terms of reference when describing newly encountered peoples is a significant feature of many of Western Christendom's early contacts with the peoples of the East. This practice was sustained during the Crusade itself, and several crusading chroniclers seem to have been guided by Byzantine authorities in their identification of different ethnic and religious groups that they encountered for the first time, including the Turks. This is hardly surprising. The First Crusaders had prolonged, if not always harmonious, relationships with the Byzantine Empire, and there were many opportunities for the Greeks to share information with the pilgrims about the peoples they were encountering. Alexius I is said to have given the Crusaders detailed advice concerning the Turks and their tactics. Several of the narratives written by participants, including those by Peter Tudebode, Fulcher of Chartres, and the Gesta Francorum, followed the above-mentioned Byzantine practice of describing the Turks as Persians at various points in their narratives. Another manifestation of this trend can be found in the First Crusade chroniclers' propensity to identify a Turkish territory to the east named as Khorasan, a name that relates to Khorasan in Persia. Again, Frankish authors seem to have been drawing upon Byzantine traditions because writers such as Anna Komnene and John Skylites also use the same name in the same context. For example, in a description of the siege of Antioch in 1098, Anna Komnene noted that the Turks appealed to the Sultan of Khorasan for aid. She later described a speech given by Bohemond in which he explained why he did not want to yield the city to the emperor's representative because he was concerned about the approach of fresh forces from Khorasan. Thus, the Crusaders' adoption and use of this toponym seems to reflect a further example of their reliance on Byzantine-mediated information concerning the Turks. The Turks are not the only group that the Crusaders learnt to identify with Byzantine assistance. The Gesta Francorum, for example, refers to Armenians serving in Kaborga's Turkish army at Antioch as Azimites. This is a pejorative term that was employed in the Byzantine Empire to define those who used unleavened bread in the Eucharist and was applied to both Armenians and Latins. Karl Barber has demonstrated that the matter of unleavened bread was the most commonly cited issue in Byzantine anti-Latin polemics at this time, and for some it became a key marker used to distinguish Orthodox from non-Orthodox. Given this term's inherent hostility towards Latin and Armenian religious observance, it's remarkable that the Gesta Francorum should have included it at all. Perhaps the author did not realise its full meaning. Even so, its inclusion in this source demonstrates an influence in its identification of Armenians. Another example of this trend can be seen in the Crusaders' references to Paulicians during their crossing of Asia Minor. The Paulicians propounded a Christian dualist theology and were to be found primarily in areas of Anatolia. Given that this community was not well known in the West, the Crusaders would almost certainly have required direction, probably from the Byzantines, to identify them correctly. Consequently, these references to Azimites and Paulicians placed the Crusaders' dependency on the Greeks for information concerning the Turks in a wider context. For the vast majority of participants, Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean would have been almost entirely unknown to them, and it's not surprising that the Crusaders, like those pilgrims who had travelled to the East before them, should have turned to their Greek allies for assistance and advice when encountering new peoples. Typically, when historians have attempted to locate the roots of attitudes expressed by the Crusaders towards the peoples and places they encountered, answers have generally been sought in sources from the Western tradition. Nevertheless, it must have been very natural for travellers from Western Christendom, both before and during the Crusade, who were faced with a world that was so wholly outside their experience, to seek guidance from the Greeks. To conclude, by the late 11th century, there were several routes by which the people of Western Christendom could have received information about the Turks. Returning pilgrims, returning knights. They carried reports of Seljuk advances back with them. So too did Byzantine envoys, merchants, trading in Anatolia or the Levant. Given that these travellers generally needed to cross the Mediterranean in order to reach Europe, it is likely that southern Europeans would have been better informed on their identity and characteristics. Some preconceptions may have been acquired from Eastern European contacts with the Hungarians, who, as we've seen, on occasion were described as Turks. As we have seen, a striking aspect of each of these potential sources of information is that they all have strong connections with the Byzantine Empire. The Greeks appear to have exerted a profound influence over early Western European ideas concerning the Turks, and this played an important role in shaping their preconceptions and terminology. This can be seen both in the advance of the First Crusade and during its crossing of Asia Minor, where many ethnic groups were identified through a Byzantine lens. One channel of communication, however, which does not seem to have supplied the Crusaders with explicit information about the Turks, is papal propaganda for the campaign. Papal sources and Crusading Charters are extremely vague in their definitions of their enemies, often characterising them as pagans or Gentiles. No source suggests that any specific information concerning the Turks was communicated by the papacy during the recruitment process pre-1098. Whether Urban's audience already knew about the Turks and were therefore aware that when he spoke of Saracens or pagans that he was actually referring to the Seljuks is difficult to establish. Either way, there is little foundation for the idea that Turks, or even to some extent Muslims, were specifically demonised to drive recruitment. With these potential sources of information in mind, it's necessary to consider the fundamental question that was asked at the start of this paper. How much was known about the Turks in Western Europe during the preparations of the First Crusade? Were they common knowledge, or were they almost completely unknown? The evidence discussed above suggests that information would have varied considerably between regions. Some groups, such as the Normans, are likely to have been substantially better informed than others. With regard to Frankish knights, those families with established links to the East, such as the Counts of Flanders, evidently had access to recent reports of Anatolia and would have known about the Turks. For the bulk of families, however, the evidence discussed above, whilst problematic, tends towards the conclusion that the Turks were relatively unknown. Certainly Guibert of Nogent, a well-informed if rather acerbic chronicler of the First Crusade, declared quite boldly that he had never heard of them, and that he'd been unable to find any reference to them in any of the sources at his disposal. In the end, he decided based on his reading of Horace, they must be descended from the Parthians. The argument that the Turks were broadly unknown is not, however, without its problems, and can only be advanced tentatively. As discussed, it's tempting to use the rather generic names found in the charters, such as pagans or Gentiles, as evidence for this claim. It could be argued that these terms are indicators that better information was simply not available, and that consequently the charter's authors were inhibited from being more precise in their language. This does not, however, seem to have been the case. Monasteries and abbeys continue to issue charters for Crusaders and Templars which describe their wars against pagans long after reports of Turks had proliferated widely across Europe. Consequently, the language employed in their information does not necessarily reflect the extent of the knowledge available to these authors. The cautiously expressed view that there may have been a widespread ignorance of the Turks, in the Kingdom of France in particular, is founded primarily on the general impression derived from the sources as a corpus. It is a judgment based on the scarcity of any references to the Turks, either in the centuries-old learning of Western Christendom or in the 11th century materials, set against a wide proliferation of references to the Turks in sources following the First Crusade and in later decades. This is simply too great a shift to pass over in silence. Thank you very much.